Okay, I think we can get started. So hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Colleen Moore. I'm the Senior Programs Director of Young Professionals in Foreign Policy, also known as YPFP. So YPFP works to build the leaders tomorrow needs. We do this by providing YPFP members with capacity building programs, engaging events, a global community of peers, and opportunities to elevate their voices through writing and publication. So we definitely encourage you to look into becoming a member of YPFP, where you will have access to opportunities that you may not have otherwise, as well as checking out some of our upcoming events. And I'll drop those links in the chat in just a minute. But we're so excited to collaborate with IPF Atid for this event. Thanks so much for joining us, and I will pass it over to Zach.
Thanks, Colleen. My name is Zach Schenk, the chair of the IPF Atid Washington, D.C. Steering Committee. IPF Atid is a young professionals network of the Israel Policy Forum. With chapters and community members across North America, we are all committed to the same thing: secure, Jewish, and democratic Israel. To achieve this goal, we believe that the two-state solution between Israel and Palestine is the best option for both Israelis and Palestinians to live in safety. During the month of June, IPF Atid led the Our Future Israel campaign, where Jewish millennials and young professionals raised our voices against West Bank annexation. During this time, we engaged with 745 young professionals and published 15 op-eds in local, national, and international media outlets. I want to thank our two speakers, Rawan Odeh and Shaqued Morag, for joining us today. Rawan is the Managing Director of New Story Leadership, a leadership development incubator for Palestinian and Israeli change agents. She spent half of her life in New York and the other half in Nablus, Palestine. She was a New Story leadership delegate in 2017 and has spent time working and writing on the economics and banking in the Middle East. Shaqued is the executive director of Peace Now, Israel's longest standing advocacy movement for peace and the two-state solution. She's previously served in senior positions in the Meretz political party, as well as a community coordinator in Jerusalem for a grassroots Jewish Palestinian organization for social change. Before we begin, I want to go over some basic housekeeping. Unless otherwise stated, both Rawan and Shaqued speak for their respective organizations. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be moderating this conversation. However, I'm a volunteer and do not represent IPF Atid or the Israel Policy Forum. During the course of our conversation, if anyone in the audience has a question, please send it in via the chat function, and we plan to get to as many of your questions as possible during the next hour. I'm hoping that each of you can provide an overview of where things currently stand. On July 1st, the Israeli government was able to begin the process of annexing parts of the West Bank. It has now been a month and annexation has not taken place. Both Israel and Palestine are dealing with the coronavirus and the economic impacts, and additionally, Prime Minister Netanyahu is faced with protests against his premiership and calls to resign due to his indictment and corruption charges. And today, Prime Minister Netanyahu said that annexation is not off the table and the delay in implementation is because of the United States. With that background, where does the debate in Israel and response in Palestine stand, and what role have civil society organizations played in opposing annexation? Rawan, if you want to start.
Zach, thank you for that question, and thank you all for inviting me here today. You know, it's a very difficult time, I would say, especially with civil society and organizations like New Story Leadership, because we bring young Israelis and Palestinians to Washington, D.C. to work, meet, and speak with stakeholders and Congress members to tell them what's happening on the ground, to be a part of the political discourse. So when our 10 Palestinians and Israelis finished the summer in Washington, D.C., working with Congressman Jamie Raskin, Senator Chris Van Hollen, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, met with multiple Congress members and went back home, and then our Palestinian participants came back to a reality where they were going to lose their future, because that's what it felt like for many young Palestinians back home. I personally myself, I'm from Area C, I'm from Hawara, and our house is right on Route 60. And so to me, when we're doing advocacy and we're meeting with the American policymakers and telling them this is not a good idea. It's not a good idea because it doesn't build trust between both parties. And there was a lot of despair created, I think, especially after Palestinians and Israelis meet together, spend 7 weeks and say, okay, you know, we have an establishment, we are unified in opposing the occupation and building a better future. And then you see leaders, the same leaders, time and time again, make decisions that not only impact our future, but deter us, both peoples, from recognizing a reality that we're working hard to find. So I would say on the Palestinian side, there's a lot of despair. There's this huge sense of like, what is my home now? And the apartheid question really comes up clearly now as someone that, for me personally, someone that lives between 5 illegal Israeli settlements, sees IDF soldiers on a daily basis. When annexation talks happened, it felt like this is going to be the rest of my future and the future of my people.
Great. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, go ahead, Shaqued.
First, hello everybody, and Eid Mubarak to Rawan and to others that might be celebrating Eid al-Adha these days. So first, I can tell you a lot about Peace Now's efforts to prevent annexation. We see annexation as an integral, the battle against annexation as an integral part of our activity for solution, because we've been warning from annexation for a long while. We've been monitoring the expansion of the illegal settlements, such as Rawan's neighbors, for many years by now, in order to inform the Israeli people and the international community and the media about the formal and informal policy that risks the two-state solution and that serves as de facto annexation for a long while by now. And actually, the fact that the jure annexation might happen brings the discourse to a point where our efforts are finally more, I'd say, welcome in the Israeli discourse and the global discourse, because people that lost interest in the political issue, in the conflict, there's been a long while where there is no violence, there is not much violence. The occupation is very convenient to the Israeli general public. No one feels the urgency to discuss the conflict. And all of a sudden, when an annexation threat is here, people become much more curious and they want to learn and they want to be active about it. And it makes our material and our research and our campaigns and our community of activists much more important and effective. And it comes to action in many ways, so from protesting in the streets to campaigning in the media and social media, and bringing the knowledge to the people. I can tell you that when we talk about the younger generation in Israel, as I said, they're not interested in the issue because it's not part of the agenda of the government for a long while now. And half of the battle for us is to teach them and to fight ignorance and to say, to show them the map, to take them to the territories and the West Bank and talk about what's going on there and see the occupation with their own eyes, and stress the urgency to bring the occupation to an end. So it's sad, but people in Israel, they know by heart the right-wing talking points, and sometimes our job is to educate the people and give them the basic ideas of how, why, and we fight occupation, and what's our prospect and our vision for a more a better future for both people.
So kind of going off of what you both said and really trying to focus on the hopes and aspirations of both Israelis and Palestinians. As Israelis and Palestinians have become more polarized over their views of what the final status of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should be, do you find it helpful in your organizations to start from the premise that an agreement should be made in the near future?
Maybe I can jump in on this one. I think what many people, like, what gets lost in the conversation about finding a solution is the disconnect that exists with the way Palestinians see solutions. So, for example, for me, when my younger brother was arrested at the age of 10 playing outside, it was actually, I think this is the 5th anniversary that he was taken away by Israeli soldiers after an attack happened a few miles away. The IDF did collective punishment and arrested all the children and boys on the streets, or the neighborhood of Hawara. And so for me in that moment, and even today, when I think about solutions, I think about not having children in Israeli prisons, Palestinian children that learn to fear, that learn to think that this is my life. I think about girls and boys that are going to checkpoints every day before school and thinking, am I gonna make my test? Am I not gonna make my test? Or the millions in Gaza that are thinking, how long am I gonna be stuck in siege? So when talking about solutions, I think for the past few years, people have been saying 1 state, 2 state. It's still the big conversation in DC and in the United States, but from a Palestinian perspective, we need to tackle the everyday issues that Palestinians are facing. And step 1 is occupation. You can't think that big when the next day of your life is it's filled with this ambiguity. It's filled with your dignity being taken away every time a soldier checks you and asks for your ID as foreigners are controlling your territory. And I think that's why a lot of Palestinians, you hear them saying, 1 state, 2 state, I don't care, I want my freedom. And that's a big part of the problem, because on the Israeli side, I hear a lot of our participants are like, let's talk policy solutions, let's create frameworks. And it's hard to create frameworks when you're just trying to get through the next day. And I think that's a huge disconnect. But with the annexation talk, I think for a lot of Palestinians like me, it kind of felt like, okay, now we can really have a conversation about what's going on, because we've been talking about 2 states. It's been the mainstream rhetoric and idea, and yet the Israeli government, time and time again, every policy it takes us a step farther away from it. So I think for everyone that cares about Israel and Palestine, what you see right now happening is a government that is taking us to a 1 state de facto, and it has been doing that since every time there's a new settlement pop up in the West Bank. Every time you see more Israeli military going on in my town, in my village, and across Palestine. So you have an Israeli government that is going on this direction, and I would hope that is this something that people are going to just like support or to. And that's where a lot of Palestinians feel like the world has left them behind when it comes to actually taking accountability against actions that are moving us away from a solution that the whole world is saying, let's do this. So that's my answer. Check it. I'd love to hear your thoughts, because I know what do you think it's still possible given what's going on?
So as I said, a main part of our job is to bring the stories of the occupation to the consciousness of Israeli people, because it's very convenient to ignore them. The Israeli media doesn't tell us about this reality and the oppression. And every time that people try to tell these stories, you I'm talking now to the audience, you probably have heard about the delegitimization that anti-occupation NGOs in Israel are experiencing. Whenever we bring the stories of the occupation, people blame us for betraying the interests of Israel and lying and so on. I think that peace now enjoys a certain degree of legitimacy, which allows us to reach to a broader crowd. We talk to younger generation in schools and in pre-military academies and in the media and in the social media. And we try to bring the story from a perspective that that depicts the possible solution, and not only that doesn't make people lose their faith in a solution. And it's not easy after a long, more than a decade of right-wing government that is building mistrust with the Palestinians and sabotaging every attempt to both to an effective leadership in the Palestinian side and to negotiations. And we try to show the alternative and to insist on demanding from the leadership to try the nonviolent actions that we can promote, rather than the military approach that is more popular here in Israel. That's a challenge. We try to do it in every way, including very original campaigns and different ways to open the eyes of the generation that knows no better than Netanyahu in the leadership. And we also try to build bridges. I can tell you that the young generation in Israel is very curious. One outcome of Oslo is that it's an absurd maybe, but Israelis don't meet Palestinians as they used to before Oslo. The separation is very effective, and Israelis don't, and Palestinians don't just meet each other randomly in their everyday lives. And many people come to us and say, we want to meet Palestinians, we want to talk to Palestinians, we have so many questions, and sometimes the personal encounter is a need more than anything else. And this is a challenge in times of anti-normalization campaigns, which have their own reasoning. And but when we do make it happen, as Rawan said, when smart and patient Israelis and Palestinians spend quality time together, they usually build trust and come out of this experience more empowered to imagine a different future.
So one question that I kind of have on that is, the U.S. House of Representatives recently passed a bill that would establish a $250 million fund for grassroots peace building and economic development. What can this mean for civil society organizations, such as both of yours, that operate in both Israel and Palestine?
Rawan, do you want me to start?
Sure.
I'm sorry to say it, but I think it's a bit hypocrite. I mean, it's hypocrisy, because the USA, in the last 4 years, has been undermining chances for peace. In the highways, like Trump deprived Palestinians from financing of very important budgets, and now trying to, I would call it peace wash, like pink wash. It's like, let's show that we're for peace while actually we did everything against it. I don't think that this, I don't know, it might come out for the better, but as an action, I find it a bit hypocritical.
So if I may really quickly, this wouldn't necessarily be the Trump administration that would kind of be calling for this, as opposed to the democratically led House of Representatives. So last I saw, the bill still had to go through the Senate to potentially become law and then go through the reconciliation process. But this wouldn't necessarily be kind of following on with a lot of the views and policies that the administration has taken in the past, and is kind of more of a response to some of those things that they've done.
I can't say no.
Yeah, I think
financing the civil society, it's always for it's nice, it's good, but it's not a substitute for real policy. Someone go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was gonna say, I think where Shaqued is coming from is, one, I mean, I know I've like read the fund, and I've actually New Story leadership who support the fund in terms of giving a wider scale funding for civil society, Israeli and Palestinian civil society. But if you take a look at it from a political standpoint within the fund, does it mention the occupation? No. What does it mention? Funding going to settlements and like normalizing that movement? No. So what you see is we have a Democratic House of Representatives that do see the importance of civil society, which is a huge step forward. But what's lacking even within Congress is having a real political conversation where the voices of the younger generation, like me and Shaqued and hundreds of thousands of others, are included within it, and not just putting us in a peace camp. Like, you're the hugs and hummus. We'll look to you to get hope. Like, no, include us in the political discourse, like having a real conversation and statements against occupation. And I think that's what's missing. But I do absolutely think it's necessary that we wide-scale interactions between Palestinians and Israelis. During our summer program, we had an Israeli living in a house with a Gazan woman, and they'd never met each other before. And there was an instant, I remember they told the story where Lana, our Gazan delegate, got a notification from her family that rockets had started again by the Israeli government. And she had a complete panic attack, because in that moment she thought, what's going to happen to my family? What do I do? Am I going to see them again? And this huge sense a huge sense of panic. And Gilad, her Israeli host brother, panicked with her and just thought, oh my God, and like was supporting her. And he said that like what's missing back home is most Israelis, I don't think, support the Gaza war, support rockets, they obviously support their security, but if every Israeli knew at least one Gazan on a more personal way, then when they hear that rockets are starting up again, Gilad thinks of Lana and Lana's family. And I think the same for me. My NSL delegate Katya from Ashdod, when she explained the rockets that would launch and how they would have to go into bunkers, I never thought of it before. I never saw that. So I think on the one hand, obviously civil society, we need more funding, we need more support. It's not enough. But when it comes to America and policy making, part of the discourse, and that's part of it does with putting Israelis and Palestinians on Capitol Hill. But funding is not enough. We need political action, and that's what's missing.
So as we kind of go into this next stage, especially looking at the US election and kind of what potential outcomes for that could be, a lot of focus has really been looking at the Trump administration's support for annexation of various parts of the West Bank, whether it's part of the broader scope of the Trump peace plan or potentially less, it really depends on where things might be going, but also looking at the potential election of an incoming Joe Biden administration. So as we kind of look towards the future of negotiations and kind of discussions between the Israelis and Palestinians, and kind of really looking at what that political action could actually be like, from both of your perspectives, kind of where do you think things could be going with the election or after the election? So there's a couple things that I did want to comment on just from an IPF perspective. One of them, and this was a question that we kind of saw in the chat, is the Israel Policy Forum is committed to a two-state solution. And a lot of that also entails being that we want to see and kind of supporting a secure Palestine as well, so that everyone can kind of live in peace and prosperity with their neighbors. On top of that, also seeing that there will be a study coming out in the next few months about where things might be going, kind of analyzing the Trump peace plan, what that means for US policy. We're kind of bringing it back into our current discussion right now. Where do you think that things might be going from both of your perspectives, both with the peace plan and potentially this kind of ambiguity that's up in the air from the US perspective over the next few months?
Shaqued, do you want to take this or should I go ahead?
You should go first. You're more American than me.
I am more American. Yeah. I mean, for those of you that don't know my personal story, I was born in Hawara, this tiny conservative village in Area C, and we moved when I was 3 to Brooklyn, New York. And I spent a few years there. Then when I was 15, my family wanted to ingrain Palestine and our culture, so they moved me back in hopes that I would marry a Palestinian guy. That didn't really work out too well for them. But anyways, just background as to my Americanness. The American elections, I think, yeah, I think they're really important when it comes to just the direction where the United States is heading. When it comes to Israel-Palestine, a Biden presidency, to me, I personally think it won't make the situation worse. In essence, it won't be like a Trump presidency, but will Biden hold Israel accountable for annexation? Will Biden take a strong stance against the occupation? I don't think he will. I mean, just seeing from his past statements, his politics during the Obama administration, yeah, and honestly, I think I also, and NSL comes from the perspective not to kind of look up to older men but like actually yeah, us saying this is what we want. I'm tired of seeing the older generation, the Abbas generation, the Bibi generation, and the American way of like telling us what will work and what not will work. Like, it's time for our voice to be heard and for them to take a step back. So I'm kind of like mixing things up a bit, but in terms of what I would want to see Biden, like, I don't think he will be much different than probably Obama. And I think for Palestinians in Gaza that are now, according to the UN, living in an unlivable situation, probably think it takes more of the American people, like all of you listening in today, to long pathway ahead of us in terms of coming to a point where we can like actively talk about it. And when it comes to negotiations, I don't want the same negotiators to represent my needs. I want more women on the negotiating table. And will that be the status of the next negotiation if it happens in a year or two? I don't think so. So what's important for, I think, me and many Palestinians is to have real representation, and that's our own internal struggle. Only knowing Palestinian political leader, and I politics to really maneuver the Middle East, maneuver Israel, Palestine, and shift things. I think that needs to come from people like me and Shaqued and organizations like ours.
First, I fully support what Rawan just said. I can tell you that here in Israel, the interpretations are that if Biden gets elected, then annexation will stop immediately. He won't let it move forward, and no matter which point it will be at. And I hope that he will do more. I hope he will bury the Trump plan, which is a horrible plan, and it's not a peace vision in any way. And I can hope that he does bring, as Rawan said, reframe the negotiations table and include a more wide representation in it. And but I can tell you that Trump, as I see it, Trump has lost the trust of the Palestinian people, and I don't know how long it's going to take to rebuild it. The trust of the Palestinian people in the Americans as a negotiator, as a mediator. So maybe it will take another time to rebuild the trust. So maybe not right away negotiations, maybe there needs to be some trust building steps before that.
So there was actually a study that the Israel Policy Forum, in conjunction with one of our partner organizations, the Commanders for Israel's Security did. It's called 50 Steps Before a Deal. So if anyone's interested in that, you can kind of check that out, and that kind of dictates and kind of goes through some of the steps that Israel might be able to take unilaterally that would still be able to guarantee Israel's security while also being things that could advance trust between the two sides. So we're now going to transition over to a couple audience questions. So Rawan, if you are having some difficulty with your audio and video, we can transition over to Shaqued. But this first one is for you. You mentioned that for most Palestinians, what they want is freedom and an end to the occupation. Is there an understanding on the Palestinian side the degree to which Israelis genuinely fear the possibility that a free Palestine could be either an existential threat to Israel or inflict large-scale violence in Israel, even if it isn't necessarily an existential threat to the country?
It took me time to realize that it was a question to me. I'll tell you this.
I think it was the question to me, or was it to you? Like, it cut off for me.
Yeah, I can go ahead and repeat that. So the question was, you mentioned that for most Palestinians, what they want is freedom and an end to the occupation. Is there an understanding on the Palestinian side, kind of looking at it from the civil society organization and from the general population, on the degree to which Israelis genuinely fear the possibility that a free Palestine could either be an existential threat or inflict large-scale violence in Israel, even if it isn't necessarily an existential threat?
Okay, and my apologies, my internet is a bit choppy, so sorry about that. I also realized I have like my hospital tag on. I broke my pinky finger surfing on a sand dune. So anyways, those of you that had questions about that. There are two different things to look at when it comes to that question. Palestinians that have not gone through civil society, people-to-people programs probably don't have that perspective. And I think it's because for them, their daily, everyday life is controlled by an Israeli military. So their perspective is seeing Israel as this controlling foreign entity on their lands that's creating a lot of violence for them and provocation. For Palestinians that have gone through people-to-people programs, before. I mean, I don't want to make generalizations, but I think in having conversation with Israelis about like the sense of insecurity that some Israelis face, what usually I hear Palestinians and people like myself saying is, for your security is the answer our freedom. And I think that's not a justification for controlling another population. It's not a justification for my younger sister to be traumatized by Israeli soldiers raiding our house because our house overlooks the streets. So in framing it in the way looking at it, I've heard about it, Palestinians have heard that that particular argument, but I think for me, when I look at Israeli and the Israeli state and the realization and creation of the state of Israel, many Israelis and Jews, I would think, know what it feels like to not have that safe homeland, to not be able to feel safe in where you live, or to have ownership and have autonomy. And I think we need autonomy, and it should not be based off of a sense of insecurity that other people are facing. Because otherwise it's apartheid and one state, and we're not, like, you can't have it both ways, I guess. If you want a secure and democratic and Jewish Israel, then we need to actually have a real conversation about the two-state solution. And if the conversation and the excuse is, well, we don't feel safe or insecure, then we're stepping into a dangerous one-state de facto. We've already stepped in it. So yeah, the conversation is there. The problem is how do we facilitate a solution in which it won't be perfect? I mean, I don't think that if we sit down, negotiate, and come up with a solution that ultimately the Israeli people will now feel 100% safe. And I don't think the Palestinians will also feel like, okay, now I have full sovereignty and ownership. Like, it's a process. But I don't think that we should continue to be controlled for the purpose of Israeli security.
So I
will just add also that, oh, sorry. I just wanted to add one more thing. I think Israeli presence and Israeli West Bank actually perpetuates more violence and creates more violence, because you have Israeli soldiers that, for example, on checkpoints, when they're like humiliating a Palestinian, the sense of like, this is our land, why are you here? It perpetuates violence instead of looking at it from a restorative process, looking about it from a reconciliatory process versus a military answer. And I think that will ultimately keep us in conflict.
So I have a couple of follow-ups with that. So just to make sure that I'm understanding your point, one of the things that you said was a lot of that perspective changes based off of people who have taken place and participated in these people-to-people programs. So first off, is that an accurate representation of kind of how you started your answer?
Yeah, I guess what I meant by that is Palestinians that go to people-to-people programming interact with Israelis without space for conversation, versus Palestinians that never meet Israelis on a personal level and only see them on the checkpoints, or Palestinians in Gaza that only see them through the rockets. They don't have that perspective because they don't see it, they don't have it. Yeah. So
how then do you kind of get, the collective you, get more people involved in people-to-people programs to kind of facilitate this reconciliation that can help develop new leaders, give governments space to negotiate when we eventually get to a point where that might be more feasible?
Yeah, I'm sorry, you totally were choppy in your follow-up. I didn't get it.
That's fine. So how are you kind of able to see more people involved in these people-to-people programs to help facilitate reconciliation, to help develop these new leaders that can then give government space more room to negotiate, so they don't have to, they can walk this line with their two-level game, both with their domestic constituencies as well as international presences, a little better.
Yeah, well, I think for how to get Palestinians to get into civil society programming is hard and it's really difficult. One thing that helped with News Story Leadership, one, I'm the co-director for it, so seeing a Palestinian in a leadership position within an organization that does this work is really important. And secondly, that there's a third layer to them meeting. So in our organization, they're not just meeting one another, they're also meeting with American politicians. And I think that empowerment should be there across the board when it comes to civil society, so they know that their voice is being heard. It's not just kept in a room, but it's going farther than that in advocacy. When we met with Senator Bernie Sanders, I remember our Palestinian and Israeli delegates explaining to the senator their situation, what they've lived through. One of the Palestinians said, you know, I was in Hebron giving CPR as a nurse and I was shot in the back by an Israeli soldier. I want medical staff to be protected. And when Senator Bernie Sanders, he called his chief of staff, Matt Duss, all the interns and staffers, and told them, take down notes, and looked at our delegates and said, what else do I need to know? And I think for large scaling civil society, that's what we need. The younger voices need to be heard so that there's room to say, okay, I'm gonna fight for something that will have impact.
So Shaqued, kind of taking a similar look at the Israeli side, can you tell us a little bit more about some of these young professional groups that are operating within the civil society space and how much of room they may have with the government and being able to appeal to various parties within the government, whether it's Likud or others?
It's funny that you mentioned Likud. You mentioned Likud, right?
Just as an example of a political party.
I actually do have an example that involves Likud, so I'll tell you this small story. That almost 2 years ago, we were invited by Mahmoud Abbas to the Mukata. I was invited to lead a delegation of peace activists to meet with the Palestinian president, and just for a courtesy meeting and some exchange of ideas and notions. And we brought over peace activists that, like the usual suspects, are our core activists in Peace Now. And then a young guy joined us. He was the deputy head of Young Likud. And he joined this visit and he sat there in a room with the President Abbas. And when he went out, after listening, just hearing I'm sure that everybody that is listening to this talk have heard what this young guy has heard from Abbas, that about the Palestinian leadership being open for negotiations and willing to compromise and all the core issues and how they see the solutions to them. And he went out and said, we don't listen to them enough. I'm sure that if I would be able to talk with this man, we would reach a solution. And it was very unlikely to hear from a young Likud. And after that, he was fired from his position. He was thrown away after it became known through the Israeli media. So I can tell you that Likud doesn't want us to talk to Palestinians and doesn't want us to bring the voices of the moderate voices the pro-peace attitude, and the one that sounds more, that give legitimacy to negotiation efforts. But I do know that Israelis don't necessarily fear Palestinian state. They just don't trust the leadership to actually be able to do it, on both sides, by the way. But the notion of a Palestinian state is still the most popular one, the most popular vision in Israel. As an ideal solution, they say yes, they should have a state, because of the different sorts of reasoning, by the way. But most Israelis, when they face the fact that there are millions of Palestinians on the same territory with us Israelis, and they are asked what is the best solution to that, they would say, let them have their state. And most Israelis aren't so much in love with the settlements and the territories as the right wing would want us to believe. And they're just ignorant and they don't think of it. When they are forced to think and talk of it and to listen and to come up with a solution, usually they say, yes, there needs to be a Palestinian state. And of course, that's what's the right wing and the one-staters from the extreme right. That's what they fear the most. So they keep inciting fear against the Palestinian state as it's going to be a terror state. I don't think many Israelis buy that, I must say.
So one of the things that we've kind of seen is, I think you kind of mentioned this earlier, is that the peace process between Israelis and Palestinians hasn't really been at the forefront of the multiple election campaigns, and whether it's this political discourse that is going on in Israel. There were 3 elections within the past year, and this didn't really become an issue, at least from the way that I was remembering it, until a lot of the discussion on annexation was really put forward. And most parties are running on the economic development, religious issues, partially foreign policy, as opposed to this long-standing conflict that's kind of been in a stalemate that was supposed to have a temporary solution that's now lasted for almost 50-odd years. So I was wondering if both of you could kind of comment a little bit on if annexation by itself is a symptom, or necessarily looking at what the problem is that annexation is a symptom for, and what that can kind of do for this gap between the two sides, and what both Israelis and Palestinians can help do for each other to help bring that gap a little bit closer.
Well, I do see the annexation discourse as an opportunity. As I said before, most Israelis, and as you said, they don't bother dealing with the issue, and now it's brought front and center. By the way, the fact that it's being brought front and center in this time of international and national crisis because of Corona depicts the government as very, very detached from the people. And people in Israel are some people, they don't have a very well-formed opinion about the conflict, but they say, how comes that the Israeli government brings it to us in the midst of such a crisis, instead of listening to the needs of the people and the health system needs and the economic crisis and so on. And it makes the annexation look, as I believe it is, a political spin in order to take the attention away from Netanyahu's trial, by the way, from Trump's political issues as well. It's a cynical resort for both corrupted leaders to be portray themselves as people who lead political change, when in fact they really want to maintain the status quo of them in the power positions. And this happening during the Corona crisis reveals it, and it shows their real cynicism and intentions. And I do believe this is a political spin, and this is, hopefully it's not going to happen, but it will open a new window of opportunity for us, civil society, that does deal with the issue on constantly, to get more attention from the public and maybe from the politicians as well, because they were caught off guard with this too. Many politicians didn't have a very well-formed opinion regarding neither Trump plan nor annexation in general, and they look for information and for answers, and I do believe that the next elections will deal with the issue much more profoundly, and it's for the best, because as I said, it's still the preferred solution among Israeli people. And I do believe that people vote not only on the economy issues, but also on security issues. And the one success of Netanyahu is to detach the peace process from the security issues of Israel. And it needs to be reattached and to deliver the things as they are. I mean, the two-state solution as a way to bring security and freedom to both sides.
If I can weigh in, I agree with Shaqued in terms, I also see the talk of annexation and what we've seen kind of progress as an opportunity, especially for Palestinians like me who lived in a situation that looked like it was already annexed. And I mean that by the everyday circumstances that are already in place. Like, if I need help, I can't dial 911 for the Palestinian Authority because they have no jurisdiction there. It's Israeli military controlled. So for Palestinians, we live in a situation where this is our life. We feel like our land is slowly being annexed, or it's going to be annexed. And that's why for many Palestinians, when the Trump administration first green-lighted it, we thought this is actually happening, because we've been seeing it slowly progressing. And now that there's so much attention, like right now we're having a webinar about it, there's been talks about it, the House of Representatives issued a resolution reaffirming the two-state solution. You have members of the House like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez putting a very strong statement saying that we'll hold Israel accountable. It was only 20 members, I think, that signed that, but it is stirring the pot. And I think we need to continuously push forward as it's in the spotlight, and push against it, because once annexation, or if annexation does happen, then what's to say for, the decades of processes and wanting a two-state solution to happen, the millions of Palestinians that are right now in COVID-19 on lockdown, kind of wondering with this annexation talk whether we'll ever see a Palestinian state. And I think the other part of it is also making sure that, sometimes I feel like the civil society camp is very small and limited, and other times I look at just how loud we've been kind of calling out and talking about it. I was at a J Street conference, I was speaking about Palestinian political organizing and how we can encourage more Palestinians to be political, because it is a stigma that we face because of internal politics, because of Israeli imprisonment for people that are politically active, that and our family members and friends. But during the J Street conference, Saeb Erekat was in the front row. So I'm kind of like telling a story similar to Shaqued. He was in the front row, and that was the first time that I, as a Palestinian, was like in close proximity to a Palestinian leader. And through the J Street platform, I spoke truth to power, and I told my perception. I was like, yeah, like I'm a 24-year-old Palestinian from Hawara, and I want to be like a part of the leadership. It was like, who is this girl? But like, I think for what our fighting for a solution is about is making sure that we are heard. And with this talk about annexation, using it to campaign more and campaign more and make sure that our story is an opportunity to kind of get an inside look, but also Shaqued is like an Israeli like fighting against annexation and fighting for me and a state for me is incredible. I mean, I think many Palestinians don't know about this fight towards a two-state solution. And that's a society we're unified, we're informed, we're working together so that you all kind of the public right now, but that we're working together and being stronger within the fight against annexation and ultimately a just peace.
Can I say one more optimist remark?
Of course.
I can tell you that it's not only that Palestinians aren't aware of the peace activists in Israel. As I said, there is not much attention to it in Israel as well. Peace now does enjoy a certain level of we have our brand recognition, but in general, people here, the left-wing camp suffers delegitimization. And my optimist remark is that during the last few weeks, there has been a chain of protests against the government and especially Netanyahu. And as part of these protests in Jerusalem, near near his house, is a formal, I don't know how to call it, but in Jerusalem, there has been many voices against occupation and for peace. And it's refreshing to see it, that you see thousands of young Israelis protesting for justice and for a more fair agenda from Israeli government to Israeli people, but also to Palestinian people. And you see signs of all kinds that call for the end of conflict and for ending the occupation, and they get accepted very widely. And while the media keeps telling us that, you see, this is a left-wing demonstration as if it is something that is not legitimate to do, it is legitimate in the streets, and we're changing the discourse, and we're bringing the message of a recognition of the occupation, and we're bringing this issue front and center to the protest in the street. And I think it has a very important educational role in the political framing of the next era in Israel. And I really, really hope to see a change during this from this direction as well, because people lost trust in the Israeli government and leadership, and part of it is we don't buy their lies about the need to occupy the Palestinian people because of security. This is a lie, and people are starting to see it, and this message gets more and more accepted, and I hope it gets wider with time.
So I want to thank both of you for taking the time to speak with all of us today and share your perspectives about the situation that exists on the ground in both Israel and Palestine. Now more than ever, responsible leadership is needed when confronting complex challenges. And one of the ways that is able to happen is by ensuring that civil society organizations are able to hold leaders accountable like you've both spoken about. For everyone who's interested, I invite all of you to learn more about the Israel Policy Forum, our programs, and our research on israelpolicyforum.org, as well as to follow us on social media. And I wish you all well and to stay healthy and safe going forward.